this our so I'd like to introduce Janet Flint, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome to Dr. Cornelisse. I'm happy to get to introduce Tara Cornelisse. I found out about her work through a legacy YouTube webinar she did with the Pollinator Friendly Alliance. She tells a story of insect conservation and environmental pressures with bold graphics and backs it up with good, clean science. Dr. Cornelisse is an invertebrate zoologist at NatureServe and has over 20 years of experience in entomology and conservation biology. She earned degrees at Boston University, San Francisco State University, and a Ph.D. from the University of California, Santa Cruz, focusing on tiger beetle conservation. At NatureServe, Tara assesses the conservation status of invertebrates, which informs state and national conservation priorities. She is also editor of the Natural Areas Journal. Please help me welcome Dr. Tara Cornelisse.
Thank you. All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Get my PowerPoint up here. All right. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the screen all right. Okay, great. Thank you, Janet. So I am excited to be here tonight to talk to you all about insects. Not as excited to talk about the decline of insects, but excited about insects nonetheless. And then with some focus on some species and some issues in the Central Valley as well. So as Janet mentioned, I am at NatureServe. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I'm going to share some data that we recently published about pollinator decline. And so NatureServe, some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not. It used to be part of a nature conservancy, but basically we are a national nonprofit that is composed of a network. And so we have about 60 network programs, and all of those programs are the natural heritage programs for the states and the provinces of Canada. In California, we have the Natural Areas Diversity Database, and other states have different named things. And basically at NatureServe, we're kind of the central network of all, or a central repository of all this network, where they go out to their states and they track species and ecosystems, and then we are able to bring those data together to use for some really unique products, some of which I'll share with you today, that we hope to advance the conservation management of biodiversity as well as ecosystems. And so here are a smattering of our network partners. As you can see, it's kind of an alphabetical order of all the states and provinces where we've got our network partners where they keep track of those species. And so here's sort of a visual way of looking at what NatureServe does. Basically, the network partners there, they have the zoologists, the botanists, the folks that are in the field gathering the data on the different species. And then we take those data and actually create these products, one of which I will talk to you a little bit about today, and that's the conservation status assessments of species. And that's that third one down on the right-hand side. And so we did a project looking at the status of pollinators in the United States and Canada. So I'll focus a little bit on that. But obviously I'm here today to talk to you about insects in general, but pollinators, as you being a native plant society, your pollinators are particularly near and dear to all of our hearts, and they tend to be the ones, as I'll show you in a moment, that have the most evidence of decline, unfortunately. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an introduction to insects, I never know how much people know about insects in general. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's almost nothing. So I'd just like to kind of talk a little bit about what they are and how important they are. So they make up the bulk of the biodiversity on this planet. This is the pie chart of animals and the number of species of animals that we know, that we have named on this planet. And you can see there's kind of like an insert in the pie chart. There's the arthropods, which is over 75% of the number of animals we know. All arthropods includes not only insects, but also things like crabs and spiders. And if you move out just a little bit, about 75% of that pie is insects. And so insects make up the vast majority of the species that we have named on this planet. And so by sheer number, we know that they're very important. Um, and so what are insects? Well, insects have some defining features. One of them is that they always have three body parts, so a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And they also have three pair of legs. So there's always going to be six legs. That's one way you can differentiate them from other groups of invertebrates. And most of them have wings. Not all of them have wings, but a lot of them do have wings and one pair of antenna. And sometimes those wings are modified, such as here in this ladybug, where you can see that it's got that sort of harder outer wing shell. Flies are also another group where they have modified wings. You can see flies here have their second pair of wings modified into these things called halteres, which give them their name flies because they're very good at using those for balance and flying well. Another unique thing about insects is that there are two major kinds of development. The one on the left, the complete metamorphosis, is probably the one that most of you are familiar with, especially if you've had the joy of raising a caterpillar to become a butterfly. You know that there's those stages where there's the egg, the larvae, the caterpillar, and then the pupa or the cocoon or chrysalis, and then the adult. But that's just sort of one half of the story for insects. In fact, there's lots of groups of insects that do incomplete metamorphosis. As you can see here, grasshoppers are one of them. And in that case, they emerge from the egg, but they emerge kind of looking like a mini adult. So sort of like mammals do, right? Like we do, right? They come out looking like a mini adult and then they grow until they reach the sexually mature adult. And so I'd like to talk about these different kinds of development strategies because it has been one way that insects are so evolutionarily successful, like why we have so many species, because they've been able to, having these different life stages, been able to really capitalize on all the different microhabitats, all the different niches out there in ecosystems and evolve into the wide variety of species that we have today. And they're also best known, I think, at least in the conservation circle, for their important functions in ecosystems. They do many things. Some of them are things like nutrient cycling. Here, dung beetles are pretty famous for that. They directly put the nutrients back into the ground. Termites are also pretty well known for that and decomposition as well. And then the thing that insects are most well known for, and probably what you all know them best for, is pollination. So here's a picture of a hoverfly here. It got its face deep into the flower, sucking up that nectar and getting pollinator all over. Seed dispersal is another one that's very important role that insects play in relation to plants as well. And ants are particularly good at seed dispersing. Another one is biological control. Particularly, you go out there in the Central Valley, living near a lot of agriculture, biological control of pest species is extremely important. So having these natural predators, things like parasitic wasps or predator insect species, they can really help reduce the need for pesticide use. And then finally, one example role is through being an indicator species. So this is a picture of a dragonfly nymph underwater. And the aquatic insects like dragonflies, like caddisflies, mayflies, and stoneflies are known as being really important indicators for water quality. So people can go out and measure how many species there are of these different aquatic insects, and that can be a direct correlation to how the quality of the water, if it's polluted, if there's a lot of turbidity in that water. So it helps us know too if it's safe for us as well. So there's many different roles that insects play. These are just a few of them, and it could go on, but I won't do that. So also, one thing that is of note, though, is that folks have tried to figure out how much are these services worth. There's been some studies on this. One of like a very comprehensive one that was just on insects, was done almost 20 years ago now, actually. But even then, it estimated that insect and their ecosystem services were probably valued around $67 billion a year in the United States alone. So that's not even worldwide. So, they do a lot of really important things for us. And they are extremely important in ecosystem functioning. So what's happening now, basically, is what we're concerned about. You may have heard of some headlines about insect declines. One of the most famous ones, I can kind of skip ahead of my slide here, was in the New York Times, published a paper, an article on the what they called the insect apocalypse and how it's here. But there's also, unfortunately, a lot of science that is showing that that actually is kind of coming to be the case. Apocalypse, maybe some people would argue that that is a little bit of a hyperbole, but we've definitely seen insect declines, and there's a lot of evidence for it. One of the first papers that came out that looked at this, even before the New York Times article, was in 2014, where researchers looked at how human activities were impacting animals and found that globally, about 67% of invertebrate populations over the past 40 years show about a 45% decline in mean abundance. So there's a lot of studies that look at different measures of insect decline. Sometimes it's species diversity, sometimes it's biomass. In this case, it was abundance. So just like the sheer number of insects. And they looked at it in looking at the different groups to see which ones seem to be more impacted. And the graph here is showing you the percent of insect species that are decreasing, increasing, or stable, with the red being decreasing. And so you can see that a really large portion of the first group, which are beetles, as well as ants, bees, and wasps, are declining. And in fact, all of the grasshopper species that they looked at, including in that order also includes crickets, were declining. Whereas the butterflies and the dragonflies were a little bit less, but still a pretty high number, almost a quarter, or maybe even around a little more than a quarter for the butterflies, were declining in abundance. So this is one of the studies that kind of kicked off a bunch of other studies. And this was just 10 years ago. So since then, we've learned a lot about insect declines. So I kind of mentioned already, like, it got picked up in the popular press. And one of the articles that really was the impetus behind that came out of Germany. And what that study found, they had looked at insect biomass in areas that were actually mostly protected. So these areas hadn't really changed much over 30 years. And they just collected insects kind of in mass and weighed them. And they found that the weight, or the biomass, of the insects over 30 years declined around 75%. And so they didn't have much of a reason as to why that was, but they published this. They have really solid long-term data, and it kind of set off the alarm bells that something's really going on here, and it's not just in urban areas or like really highly agricultural areas. It's all over. There have since been many studies. Here's just kind of a smattering of them. And the main takeaway has been basically that insects are declining on average about 2% annually in temperate areas, in terrestrial areas as well. So there's a little bit different pattern for aquatic insects, but in temperate areas, so not tropical, we don't have enough data on that yet, really, but in temperate areas, we're seeing about a 2% decline annually of insect abundance. And that might not sound like a lot. Maybe it does to some of you, maybe some not so much. But if you look at a graph of what a decline of 1% and 2% looks like, starting out at around 10,000 individuals, you can imagine it's actually pretty alarming. So, over the course of 40 years, or, someone's career in entomology, you're going to end up with just a 1% decline, less than half of what you start, or almost less than half of what you started out with, about a third of what you started out with. Whereas with a 2% decline, you're getting down to really low numbers there. So, for a student who's just starting out in their career, they could see a really big decline over their career if they're studying insects. So it's pretty concerning for sure. Another concerning point is that it doesn't seem to be necessarily all groups. It's a lot of groups, and some of them are actually declining worse than others. And this could be, I do admit, a factor of just what we know more about versus what we don't know about, because there's a lot of insects that we just don't know a lot about, and that will come up again. But we know a lot about pollinators, and maybe that should be alarming too, that in fact they are actually seeming to be declining more than maybe some of the other groups. And just to kind of give you some data on that, here's a figure from a paper in 2021 that looked at all of the records of the publicly available records of two families of bees. The Megachilidae, which are the leafcutter bees, that's on the top graph, and the Apidae, which are include things like bumblebees, honeybees, digger bees, and some others as well, carpenter bees. And they found that since, you know, the 1950s, there's been like a general, you know, up and down of the number of records of these families, but within the last 20 years, they've really declined. So just looking at the number of records that are available is kind of surprising, and also especially because, you know, there may have been and likely been a lot more surveys in recent years. So we actually should be seeing an increase in records. Another paper looking at butterflies in the Midwest also found a decreasing trend since 1995 till when the paper was published in 2019. And this one did find about, again, that 2% per year, they were losing butterflies in that area. So knowing all this and kind of looking at this, and we at NatureServe, where I spend a lot of time working on invertebrate conservation statuses, we're really interested in trying to see, can we use our data to look at what is the status of pollinators in the US and Canada? So we recently published a paper in PNAS about the elevated extinction risk of pollinators. And we found that, and I'll show you some of those figures in a moment, but about 1/5 of native North American pollinators are at some kind of risk of extinction. And so we were interested in these questions. Basically, again, what is the overall status of these species? Which groups are most at risk? We looked at several different pollinator groups. We were also interested in the geography of this. And so where do these at-risk species occur? And then, of course, what's causing it? What and where are the major stressors of these at-risk species? And this probably goes without saying, but just in case, I like to kind of define what we meant as a pollinator. So pollinators and what we were looking at, we defined as animals that transfer pollen while they feed on nectar or pollen. So things like bees and butterflies, but also there's some vertebrate pollinators, right? Like birds and bats that we did include in the study, but the vast majority of the species in the data I'll show you today are insects. And this might go without saying to this crowd, but why do they matter? Well, you probably know, right? They pollinate about 1/3 of our crops, and so they provide us with food and fiber, especially the more nutritious foods like fruits and vegetables. They also pollinate around 80% of other flowering plants, so non-crop flowering plants, and so make lots of habitat and make our planet and our garden beautiful. And then, as we just talked about, they're known to be declining. So we were really interested in looking at pollinators in particular. So what did we include? Well, we included several groups of insect pollinators. We included lots of bees. So we included the family of Apidae, which again, I kind of mentioned earlier, where includes bumblebees, carpenter bees, digger bees, and things like squash bees as well. We included the family Megachilidae, which are the leaf cutters, and then we included some species of sweat bee as well. We included all of the butterfly species, and we pretty much tried to do a status assessment for all the butterflies that we know that occur in Canada and the United States. We also included some moths. Moths are a bit tricky in determining which actual species pollinate. So there's lots of moths that don't actually feed as adults at all. So we just included some macro moths, some of the bigger moths that we know that pollinate. We also included flower flies, particularly some subfamilies that we know a little bit more about. And then a couple families of beetles. We included a handful of beetles that we know are important pollinators as well. So we have all these species, and the thing that we do at NatureServe that I do, that I spend a lot of my time doing, is assigning a conservation status to these species. And we do that through this scientific process that uses what we call the rank calculator. It automates the process, it promotes accuracy and transparency. And you've probably seen NatureServe ranks, and you may not even have known that those are NatureServe ranks. Like if you Google a species and look at its Wikipedia page, oftentimes on the side, the NatureServe rank will be there, and it'll tell you if it's secure or vulnerable or imperiled, for instance. So how do we assess species? Well, it's a pretty involved process, but I won't go into the ranking detail here. But we basically use three main categories. We use a category that we call rarity. And so this is looking at the species range overall. So where does it occur? And it's in the US and Canada. In this case, we were focusing on those two regions. We also account for the number of occurrences. So it's kind of like the number of subpopulations that are sort of independent evolutionary entities. We also look at the trends of species. So trying to see, can we figure out if in the short term, the species is decreasing or increasing or staying the same? And we also look at that in the long term. And then finally, we also look at the threats. So what's threatening these species, and then how bad is it, and how much of its range is it threatening that species? We use lots of data sources. You may recognize some of these if you're in the data world. The NatureServe network as well. Like I mentioned, we've got all those great folks in their states on the ground collecting data, as well as iNaturalist. So that's probably one you are maybe more familiar with, since it's a community science program that we actually use a bit, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later too. And of course, we use published papers. These are just a couple examples of some that were published in the last few years that were super useful. The one on the left is about ranges of bees in the United States, and then with over 3,000 species included. So that was very useful. And then the one on the right is looking more in the Western states at butterflies and how they have gone up or down using long-term data sets. So we put all this information for every single species that we rank into the NatureServe rank calculator, and we get a rank out. And the rank scale looks something like this. So we either get secure, which is a G5, and G stands for global because it's throughout the entire range of the species, or a G4. And those two categories we kind of count as secure. And in our pollinator analysis, we counted those two categories as secure. And then we get into the those that have a little bit elevated risk of extinction. So that goes from vulnerable at G3 to possibly extinct at GH, that means that we haven't seen the species in several decades. And we probably know that there's been some survey effort, so that's why it's classified that way. And then some, of course, especially with insects, you can imagine a lot of them fall into this sort of category under the arrow here, the data deficient or the GU category. Okay, so I'll show you now some results that we found. We ranked all these pollinators within the last few years. You can imagine it took years to do. We included, I think around, I'm trying to remember now, I'm blanking on the number. I think around 1,500 species, a lot of species. So we include a lot of species we've ranked over the years in recent times, and just analyzed their status. And so we found that there were, on average, 22.6% of the species were at risk of extinction. So falling into one of those categories of vulnerable to historical. And we have a range here from 20.6 to 29.6 because it takes into account how we incorporated the data deficient species. So the data deficient species, you can imagine, probably are rare. There's probably something happening with them that makes them less likely to be found in surveys. Something could have happened. So we just don't have enough data about them. Of course, there are definitely some that there just haven't been surveys for, or they're very cryptic. People have trouble finding them. So to get the higher number, we included all of those data deficient species in the at-risk categories. So if we did that, then about 30% of the pollinators would be considered at risk of extinction. However, if we did the opposite, then about 21% of them would be considered at risk of extinction if we didn't include those species. So we take kind of an average and assuming that the GU are at risk at the same proportion as all the ranked species. And that's where we get that 23%. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at the different groups of insects that we included. So the number one group that was most at risk of extinction were the bees. This might be unsurprising to some of you if you follow some of this literature. In fact, we found on average around 35% of the bees were at risk of extinction of some level. The butterflies and moths were more around 20-25%. The flower flies or the hoverflies, and the beetles were actually at less a percent. You can see here that the flower flies, they actually they have a pretty big gray bar. So a lot of them were more in that unknown category as well. Oh, and I forgot to mention the numbers in parentheses next to the names of the groups are the numbers that we had included in our study. And I also wanted to point out to the light blue bars, those apparently secure. So these are species that are at G4. So they're not what we consider maybe at risk of extinction, but there's something going on with them that makes them not in that higher secure category. They are either declining slightly, or there's some high threats to them, or potentially maybe they just don't have that many records. So there's something that indicates to us that, you know, there could be something going on there for conservation value. So even though they are considered kind of secure in this, there's still, you know, something to watch out for. So let's look at where these species occur. Our range and occurrence data allowed us to analyze where the pollinators are most at risk. And what these slides are showing you, the maps, the one on the right is showing you where the overall pollinator species richness is in the US and Canada. The darker the blue indicates there are more species there. So you can see our California is outshining a lot of the other states. And then the map on the left is showing you where the at-risk pollinators are. Unfortunately, again, California is up there in that darker red with more at-risk species. And this pattern of having kind of those more at-risk species in the Southwest actually followed the most at-risk group of the bees. So these graphs are just showing you the bees. So on the right, where all of the bee richness was, and then the left, where the at-risk is. And that there are more at-risk bees in the Southwest is likely due to the fact that in the Southwest we have many narrow-range specialist bees. This area of the world, you all know, is very floristically rich, but it is also topographically rich. There are many habitats, lots of unique flowers, as well as bare ground, which is a really important component of habitat for many bees, as about 75 plus bees actually nest in the ground. So these are habitat features that are found in the West and the Southwest, but also make it so we get these specialist species that have more narrow ranges that are more likely to be at some kind of risk of extinction. Great. And we also looked a little deeper into the different groups of bees. So those of you who maybe are interested in different types of bees, we classified them kind of in their main categories. Mostly this goes along with either a family or a genus. But the groups that had the most vulnerable or at risk of extinction were leafcutter bees was the number one. And you can see here over 40% of them were at risk of extinction. You can also see there's a big red chunk here next to the leafcutter bees, and unfortunately there are over a dozen species of leafcutter bees where we just don't have records for them for the last 30 years. And so it's thought that they either might be extinct or there's also issues of what we call taxonomic issues. So we just might not know, maybe some of the species were called something different in the past. That's also something to look out for, but they tend to be a little bit more rare. And it also shows us where to concentrate our efforts when we work with people who can go out and actually survey for these species, they can then, figure out, oh, we need to look for this group that hasn't been seen in a long time. Other groups of bees that are highly at risk are digger bees as well as bumblebees. This probably comes as little surprise as well. And then those that have less so were the mason bees. But as you can see, they have a pretty big gray bar, so a lot of them are unknown as to their conservation status. And then looking at the butterflies show a slightly different pattern. So again, the overall species richness on the right and the at-risk species richness on the left. They're also highly at risk in California and the Southwest, but also more sort of a little bit in the north and in the Rocky Mountains. And butterflies we know have been particularly hit hard by climate change. So drought has been a big issue, but also changes in snowpack. A lot of these sort of specialized mountain meadow butterflies will overwinter as eggs or first instar caterpillars. And so they depend on a snowpack to kind of insulate those life stages. And if the snow is either not there or melts too soon or turns to ice, it can be, oops, sorry, it can be very detrimental to those species. All right, and the biggest threats. So what did we find? The biggest threats to pollinators. Climate change came out as the #1 threat to our pollinator groups. This is one of the first times that in an assessment like this, climate change has come out as the #1 threat, and that's because a lot of these assessments are more recent, and we have better data now about how climate change is disrupting life cycles of insects as well as changing flowering seasons. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then the other two were agriculture and habitat loss. And these result not only in fewer places for the bees to nest, but also in fewer wildflowers and host plants, as well as an increase in the use of pesticides, which are a direct threat to pollinators. We're also interested in looking at where the threats are, and unsurprisingly, agriculture was the biggest threat in sort of the center of both countries, whereas climate change has become the biggest threat out west here. And the East Coast has some more issues with sort of development and general pollution as opposed to just pesticides for agriculture. So you may have been noticing that California is pretty important when it comes to pollinator biodiversity. It's also the result of one of the places with the highest at-risk biodiversity. So this is a map, one of NatureServe's kind of important data products that we produce, so the map of biodiversity importance. And it just sort of reiterates the importance of the West. This is not just pollinators, this is actually all species that we have in our database. And so the West and California in particular really is highlighted here as a concentration of area of imperiled biodiversity. The Southeast is as well, and that is mostly a result of the fact that freshwater species are included in this assessment as well, including mussels and fish and whatnot. And so they tend to come out a lot more, and amphibians imperiled in the Southeast. But we've got our kind of corner of pollinators here in California. So I wanted to kind of dive in a little bit more into where your chapter is in the Central Valley. So I wanted to look a little deeper into the insects in the area covered in San Joaquin and Stanislaus and Merced counties. And so I turned to iNaturalist. I love this platform. Hopefully some of you are familiar with it and you use it. But it's a great way to kind of look and see what biodiversity you have in your area. And so what I did was I tried to make delineate the area of where your chapter is. And I know I've left out some, but they only give you a circle and a square. And so it was very difficult to do this without actually including the foothills or the Sierras. So it might be a little smaller than you actually cover, but for the most part, I think I got some good areas here in the Central Valley. And what I found was that even in this small area, there are almost 600 species of insects that have been identified to a level considered what they call on iNaturalist research grade. And that means that it has been identified by more than one person. And so there's much more like high likely that it's in fact the true identification of the insect. So there's again 600 species, and they've been identified or are captured by 960 observers. So there's lots of people, lots of great folks, probably some of you in your area who are contributing to these observations. So just to kind of give you an overview, here are the top 10. Unsurprisingly, there's a handful of non-native species, including the western honeybee, which is very common in the Central Valley because of its agricultural importance. Cabbage white butterfly, Asian lady beetle, and the paper wasp. But we've got a good smattering of native species as well, including the fiery skipper and a couple of dragonflies, and the valley carpenter bee, which is such a beautiful bee. And then here are the next 10 common, and you can see here there's no non-native species in this case. So these are all native species to the Central Valley that have been captured by folks using iNaturalist. So I wanted to kind of go through some groups of insects that come up in the Central Valley, and the first one here are beetles. So we look at some different groups of beetles in just in this area that circle that I showed you earlier. There's 118 species of beetles that have been captured on iNaturalist. And a lot of them are, actually there's a bunch of different kinds, but a couple of them are ground beetles, which are predators, some weevils, which are herbivores for the most part, as well as a water beetle there too. But what I wanted to talk a little bit more about is this one here, this ornate checkered beetle. And this actually was included in our pollinator study. Luckily, this beetle, like a lot of the other beetles, was rated as a G5. So this beetle seems to be doing okay. It's secure. And it, you can see on the map here, this is where it's found. So it's all over the West, with kind of California being one of the big hot spots of where it's found. But it seems to be doing well. It's a pollinator. The females actually lay eggs on flowers. And I don't know if you've heard the story about these beetles, but they actually are parasites on bees. And so the beetles lay eggs on the flowers, and then the bees come to the flowers, as they do, to get nectar and pollen. And the larvae latch onto the bee, go back with the bee to its own nest, and then eat the provision that the bee has created for its young. So they're, they pollinate, but they also take away a little bit in the pollination. But that's nature, right? But they're pretty cool beetles. As you can see, they're pretty gorgeous. One reason they're doing okay as well is because they're habitat generalists. They can be found in meadows, pine forests, shrublands, even deserts as well. So they can get around in the West. And then I wanted to look a little bit at the bees. So here are the top 10 bees that were captured on iNaturalist. There's never too many of these guys because unlike maybe some of you, a lot of people are afraid of bees and they don't get close enough to take photos where you can actually put them online. So it is hard to actually use sometimes iNaturalist data to really see where bees are. But bumblebees, a lot of people love bumblebees, so we get good data from iNaturalist on bumblebees. So there are 27 species, and I was really excited to see that there were actually 11 observations of Crotch's bumblebee. I don't know if you know too much about this bumblebee, but it is protected by the state of California now under the California Endangered Species Act. And you can see in its range here that it's really truly a California bee, right? It does kind of eke into Baja a little bit, but for the most part, it is in our state, and it is, it's a representative bee of California. It's a pretty cool looking bee as well. It has a lot of cropped hair. But one of the reasons it's protected despite all these red dots here, it actually has declined. It used to have many more abundant populations. And so it's declined over 80% in recent years. And so the Xerces Society is keeping really good track of bumblebees. I heard some of you may have just learned how to do the bumblebee atlas, which is great. And so we know that this species has really declined a lot. It's really impacted by agricultural conversion, by pesticides, and of course, climate change as well. Uh, and another group I wanted to look at were the syrphids, or the flower flies, or the hoverflies. A lot of us know them as. And these are really cool species, and they're all pollinators, like the adults. Pretty much all adult syrphids, I think there's a tiny little group that doesn't, will visit flowers, and they pollinate. And one I wanted to highlight was the Western aphid eater. And so the Western aphid eater is a lot like a lot of other syrphids in that it has a pollinating adult stage, the fly that you see here, and the larval stage is the aphid eater. So you may have noticed that it's called an aphid eater, but this stage, this adult does not eat aphids, it's the larvae stage. So here we have in one package, in one individual insect, both the biological control and the pollinator. So these syrphid flies are super useful in agricultural settings. And then finally, I wanted to look a little bit at the butterflies. There's 110 species that have been captured in this area. Here we've got the monarch and our typical sort of swallowtail, but it's also some other cool species. So one was the small checkered skipper, and this one, oh, I've been forgetting to say the ranks, but this one is ranked at vulnerable, or G3. So this species has kind of a moderate number of occurrences, and its range is pretty big. It's found in the Southwest, but that also means that it's pretty impacted by drought and high temperatures. It tends to be found kind of more open, dry, open habitats. Its host plant is globe mallow, so several species of globe mallow. And yeah, as I mentioned, it's declining mostly due to what we know of, at least, to drought and temperature changes that have happened over the last at least 30 years. Another one here that's also ranked as a G3 or vulnerable is the Lindsay skipper. And this one is mostly also only in California, with a little bit in Southern Oregon. And it is a grass eater. So its host plants are native grasses such as California oatgrass or Danthonia californica, and Idaho fescue as well. And this one is threatened by the conversion of its habitat both to housing as well as agriculture. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the threats in the area. And we can look at some of the projections for the Central Valley for land use change and predicted land use change by year 2050. So this was a pretty cool analysis that came out recently, looking at the land use change and the threat of it throughout the United States. And the more yellow the color, the more likely the land is vulnerable to land use change over time. And so the more darker purple, the less likely. So I've blown up the area here of the bay, and you can see the Central Valley. And in fact, it's a pretty dark purple. So the projections of land use changes are not very high, but as you all are pretty well aware, that's mostly because a lot of this area is already modified, right, into agriculture or housing. There are some pockets, like down here, of little yellow. I don't know if you guys can see my arrow, probably not, but down kind of by Merced and Los Banos, there's some area of yellow that indicates it's likely to be more developed or be converted from a natural area. So that's one thing to watch out for. Another thing that you are all probably well aware as residents of the area, that climate change is here, right? Both in terms of heat and drought. And here are some projections about the number of days per year with a heat index over 100 degrees, the historical average, The Central Valley you can see is less than 10, but going on into the future in the mid-century, so around 2050, it's projected that there'll be more of around 26 to 50 days with that heat index. So it doesn't just impact us humans, but it also impacts insects. Precipitation is another big one. Here are projections of precipitation change into the late century. And you can see that as areas get brown, darker brown, that means there's less precipitation. And then our area in California, in the winter, it's a little neutral there, but spring, summer, and fall are definitely drier. And spring in particularly is a big problem, as a lot of the native bees come out pretty early in the year, March, early April, to start provisioning and to having the next generation of those bees. And so with such a dry spring, there's less likely to be flowers available to them. And I wanted to show you a study that's been done on butterflies in the West. There's a great lab at the University of Nevada, Reno, Matt Forrester runs, and he's been just doing some fantastic work on trends in butterflies as well as their threats. And so he published a study recently looking at how warming trends are impacting butterflies. And this graph is a little complicated, but basically the vertical dotted line on the left-hand side is greater summer warming. On the right-hand side is greater fall warming. And then the horizontal dotted line above it, the butterflies are increasing in density, and below it, they're decreasing. And so with the greater summer warming, there's less of a trend downward. And that didn't surprise me too much. You know, you all know we've got really hot summers here, and the butterflies are pretty adapted to that. But the more that the fall starts warming up, I think that's really kind of where the problems start happening for a lot of these species. You know, the change in timing of when they start to overwinter, maybe their host plants or their nectar plants dry up too fast. And so that can really decrease the number of species that we have in an area. And that same paper it's probably hard for you to see these names, but that same paper looked at the top species that have already shown declines in their populations. And so there's some pretty common butterflies on here, like the monarch and the painted lady, that are being impacted as well. Okay. So climate change isn't acting alone, right? We know that it's our top threat, but we also have agriculture and housing developments, pesticides, pollution from industry. And this is a kind of a busy figure, but I really love this figure from this paper in 2021 because it really just kind of gets at the truth. You know, everyone's like, why is this happening? Well, a lot of reasons. And this whole death by 1,000 cuts is probably the best way to explain it. You know, climate change is impacting populations, but there's all these other things that they're up against as well. And so it's difficult, you know, for a species of pollinator to survive in the world with all these things coming at them at different levels. So there's a lot of synergistic threats happening. And one paper actually that shows this really well is on the Melissa blue butterfly, which it's NatureServe ranked recently down from G5 to G4. So if you remember, I kind of mentioned we got to watch out for those G4 species. Because something's happening. And this study really looked at, okay, how is this survival of this butterfly being impacted by the pesticide concentration? So that's on the axis, on the bottom axis, as well as the changes in temperature, and that's the different colors of yellow, brown, and pink, orange. And then also with the butterfly uses a different host plant than it actually prefers. And so the preferred host plant for this butterfly is a Astragalus species, but a sort of lesser host plant that it will use is alfalfa. And the survival at 0 is that red dotted line across there. And so you can see right away all the dashed dot lines are below, almost below that line. And that's when the butterfly uses alfalfa. So it's clearly not great for the butterfly survival. And then you can also see that the top lines, the solid lines, they go down when you go from left to right, and that is when the pesticide concentrations get higher. So that clearly impacts the survival of the butterfly as well. Then, if you look at the warming, so those are the different colored lines, you can also see that the brown lines and the brown color shapes are below the other two. And that is where there is higher warming. So 6 degrees of warming is really decreasing the survival of these butterflies. So taken all together, this non-ideal host plant, pesticide concentrations getting higher, and climate change, the survival of the butterfly is really impacted with all this together. So it's just a really kind of unique way to show all the things that they're up against. Okay, so let's try to now talk about kind of what we are doing about it and what we can do about it. Yes, some more better news maybe. So the bigger picture. Me and myself and some colleagues published a insect conservation roadmap in 2020. And some of the solutions that we sort of came up with were kind of these like no regret solutions. Um, and that included things like conservation of threatened species, as well as education and awareness, such as doing talks like this or getting people outside to do some surveys on insects. And as well as in the box here, the second thing was the prioritization. And so something that we're doing at NatureServe is exactly that, basically performing these large-scale assessments of conservation statuses of different insect groups to define these priority species. And so that way we can at least know where to put efforts to as well. And so the results of our pollinator analysis, for instance, they also show us where we can concentrate efforts, both in conservation management as well as in surveys. Here is a figure of how little we know about bees. And so the graph on the right with the dark purple is showing the number of species that have been observed pretty much since we've been recording since 1700s. But then on the right-hand side, this is the number of species that we've actually counted from the last decade about. So you can see that it doesn't quite match up. We should be seeing a lot more, and that's mostly because we just don't have the data available. So these are the data that are available in public databases. So we need a lot more survey effort out there. We also are able to, and this is probably the most important thing that results from these categorization of species, we're able to put these into what we call the general status assessments, or the SWAPs, which are the species wildlife action plans. So NatureServe's conservation status assessments not only tell us about how biodiversity is doing, but they feed directly into state and federal level conservation designations. So this is a figure from a recent paper about that. It showed that, at least in the United States, the state wildlife action plans, are the SWAPs, that's kind of shown here in the center in yellow. They're an important tool, but sometimes underutilized, especially for insect conservation. And conservation status assessments, which are that purple box that's circled in blue on the bottom left, they feed right into those designations. So we, like I said, we work with these state partners, and the states are the ones that determine what are the species that are greatest conservation need. That's what the SGCN stands for. And those are the species that then go into their action plans, and those are the species that in turn then get funding, they get more monitoring and conservation management. And so by knowing which ones are most at risk of extinction, it will feed directly into those species that get funding. And if so, states can then show, those who create budgets that we need this money to improve conservation status of these species. That's sort of how it all works together. Yeah. And then it can also show us where hotspots are, where conservation hotspots are, where there's trends, where there's high threats. For instance, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has created a North American bee distribution tool, and they use status rankings provided by NatureServe you can use that to filter out to see if you have species that are of conservation concern in your area or wherever you might be wanting to do a project. All right. And I don't know if you noticed back, actually, I'll go back a little bit on this slide here. The top left-hand corner says inventory, and we can't really do the assessments without inventories. We need to know where the species are and to figure out how they're doing. And so part of that, as I mentioned, that goes into that is iNaturalist. So that's something that you can do. So I have lots of suggestions for folks at home, but one of them is to participate in community science. Other ones you as plant enthusiasts probably know very well, but you can plant flowers year-round for all life stages of insects. So not just the adults during a short period, but year-round as much as you can to make sure that they're all protected. Definitely replacing exotic plants with plants native to your area. As well as eliminating pesticide use, which is a huge, huge component of it. Because, if you create a beautiful garden but use pesticides, then you're kind of creating a trap for some of these pollinators to come in, use, and potentially be killed. Another really important one is to leave the leaves. I know some folks are not big fans of this because they like kind of more manicured areas, but leaving down vegetation, brown vegetation is extremely important. Let's see if it pops up. I have a little picture here of, yeah, there it is, of a cocoon on the backside of a leaf. So I like to show this for folks just sort of like, don't pick your leaves up. That's where the baby pollinators are basically developing. So leaving the leaves. Another thing is turning off the lights at night. We have, some insects that are sensitive to lights at night that can mess up their rhythm, especially moths. Support conservation programs and policies. And now that you know lots and lots about pollinators and insect decline, you can educate others. One thing I get asked a lot about is there anything we can do about climate change at our local level? Well, yes, there's lots of things you can do, right, to reduce your energy usage. But one thing too is to just create actually little pockets of habitat for these insects. And so this paper actually kind of showed that these little pockets of habitat, like increasing structural complexity, denser vegetation, wild native plant resources year round, having a balance between herbs, shrubs, and trees, little things like that. There's kind of a list here. They create this refugia, they create these microhabitats that support insects during these climate extremes, during drought, during high temperature. And then just to encourage you some more to use iNaturalist, just show you here like how many of the data records that we get come from iNaturalist. So if you look at the top left-hand box in North America, the pies that are filled in yellow, that's like the number of non-bird, non-European GBIF records that we have of these organisms since 2020. So a large chunk, 92% of non-bird data that we've got about species comes from this platform. So use it if you can. And if you're already contributing, thank you very much. And that's all I've got for you. I'd just like to thank several folks that have worked with me on the pollinator project, as well as funders that we've got throughout the years to do these rankings. And yeah, and that's all. And I have a question slide here, so I'll hand it back over to to the Plant Society folks and get some questions.
Well, if no one else is going to take it over. So let's look at the ones I know way back toward the beginning. Camille was asked, and she said, "Did I miss it? Are you only looking at native species, or are, say, honeybees in the other bees category?" I think this is when you were showing a list of different things. And
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So honeybees are not natives. We were only looking at native species. So we did not include them. We don't do conservation status assessments on non-native species. And particularly with honeybees, they're at this point kind of more of an agricultural species. And so, it's hard to do kind of assessments on things where that humans manipulate so much.
And then you actually had a photo of you said call it a Western honeybee, but that's just the European honeybee, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So that okay. And you got kudos on your speaking style.
Oh, thank you.
Um, then Jason was wondering if there was any concern with swimming pool chemical use around insect populations.
That's interesting. I am not aware of that. Yeah, it depends on, I guess, I'm not very versed in swimming pool chemicals, but I'm sure it depends on what chemical it is. Yeah, so I don't know. Sorry.
And then Janet was curious if ag pesticides affect insect populations in our gardens.
Yes, absolutely. They do. They are, they're designed to impact somehow. A lot of them are neurotoxins, designed to impact somehow the invertebrate body. And so they impact it pollinators as well as your target, whatever pest that you're going for.
Okay, keep the questions coming, but I do have one you were talking about climate change as a big important factor in all of this. And I mentioned before the recording started, I talked about Doug Ptolemy a little bit,
Uh-huh.
and one of the things he talks about is the I think it's climate assisted migration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Basically, you have your plants that are going to struggle as the temperatures rise.
Yep.
And some people are suggesting that we should start planting different plants and try and make things up ourselves as far as where we put the plants so that we can try and put plants that are more heat resistant in areas. And he's saying, whoa, not so fast, because we should go ahead and keep the plants that are around and let them evolve. There will be
Yeah.
deaths, there will be losses of plants, but we should just go ahead and give them an opportunity to try and
Adapt.
adopt.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious how that affects the insects themselves, because obviously the insects themselves are going to be doing some migration uh, as the temperatures rise too, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. And I agree with him. I think that, nature is resilient, more than we give it credit for. And as soon as we put our hand in that, I don't know if we do such a good job. Um, and things are changing kind of in a non-linear way, so it's difficult to say like, oh well, it's getting hotter, so let's move this up the mountain or something like that. It's not necessarily the case because precipitation is changing as well in a non-linear way, and the years are fluctuating, and so unfortunately I think it's the same for insects that will have some increased mortality and extinctions as well as these things happen. And the best thing we can do is kind of to create as many habitats as we can ourselves, whether in our homes, our neighborhoods, um, or the like, to try to help them adapt as much as they can, to have some of these areas. Um, so I think having some of those, like some of those solutions that I had up last time that you can do on some type of small scale, will help insects adapt at least. Yeah.
Cool. And actually, a whole bunch of questions came in. Just see. Do How will the issues with removing leaves for fire mitigation affect insect habitats?
Ooh, that is a good question. Unfortunately, yes, I know it's a necessary evil, especially if you live in the urban and wildlife interface. You've got to protect yourselves. Um, but yeah, any removal of, downed vegetation, you're likely to be removing some habitat for insects. So it is something to be aware of. If it's possible, if you have property or areas where you're able to keep some of it or potentially move it maybe a little further away from your house. Just having some of that available, having some of that habitat is really useful.
And her follow-up was, has any cooperative work been done on this?
Cooperative work. Um, I I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. Then Janet says, your graphics are so powerful. Could we use them at presentations in our communities?
That's a good question. It depends on the graphic. I steal them some from, I attribute them to people, and I usually only use pictures that have, a Creative Commons license where you can use them and put the attribution. So, yeah, I think those are fine because you'd just be doing the same as I. Um, and yeah, the graphics from our paper are fine to use as well. So for the most part, I'd say it's okay. If there's any specific one or questions, I'm happy to look into that too. I'm yeah, not super versed in that kind of copyright stuff, but I try to do my best.
All right. Camille asks, how much do non-native plants impact breeding cycles? For example, monarchs and overwintering milkweeds.
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy around that specific example. Um, I know that it can kind of create sort of resident monarchs in some cases, and then there's some concern too that it's increasing the disease, um, the parasite. I'm blanking on the name right now. That's
OE.
huh?
OE.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's the abbreviation, right? Oh yeah, that's impacting the monarchs. Yeah, exactly. Um, but in general, it depends a lot, I would say. If the plant is invasive and it takes over a lot of the area and then can actually take over the host plant of the species, then that's obviously a big problem. Non-native grasses are a huge issue in the grasslands because not only does it take over native grasses and wildflowers, but also bare ground, which is a really important component. A lot of those annual grasses, they grow and grow and grow and build up lots of thatch. And so then there's no bare ground left for pollinating or other insects even too that use bare ground to nest, which is many of them. Um, and so that's a problem. So it really does kind of depend. There are some, I think maybe like some garden plants that they're not going to spread, they're not going to go crazy that pollinators will use as nectar sources, so they're not sort of that way they're potentially not a problem.
How do you correlate climate change with insect declines, and what are the methods?
Oh, that is a good question and very difficult, and actually not really something we do per se. It's more of uh, I mean, we don't do it per se, but we do take it from some papers like that one that I showed from Matt Forrester's lab. He's able to kind of do it. It's a lot of modeling. Basically, you figure out sort of what's going on with the temperatures and then how are the declines happening? Are they increasing, decreasing, and then model the trends together to see if there's a statistical significance.
That was
Um,
my question.
oh, okay.
It's something that I'm interested in doing, so yeah, I'll have to look up Matt
Yes.
Forrester.
Do look at his papers. He's got two, one from 2021, which is one that graph I showed, and then another from 2023, which is wider, and he shares all of the sort of background data and all of yeah, it's amazing. So definitely check into that. I basically just use that information to then create my trends analysis, which is to use the numbers from those publications to say like how much of this population of the species is being impacted by droughts or temperature increases.
Okay, thank you. I
Yeah.
guess I'll introduce my other question too. Like, so NatureServe, you have these conservation listings, like status of insects or
Uh-huh.
species.
Yep.
And like, how does that align with federal or state species status listings? And do you at NatureServe help inform federal and state listings?
Yes, great question. So for we definitely do for state, but for federal, we don't inform unless our status assessments are used to petition a species. So in order to get the species listed at the federal level, you have to petition it to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. Um, But that's just for like endangered species. There are other several classifications at the federal level. So the Forest Service and the BLM, they have their special status species. And those actually are directly informed by the NatureServe rankings. And so I work on some projects with those agencies to rank some species that they're interested in to kind of see how they're doing in some specific potential priority national forests, for example, or some potential areas. So they are really important in terms of informing whether a species would stay on or get on like a special status list, and then of course become part of their management plans. As I mentioned, the states, it's directly related for sure, because a lot of those network programs of NatureServe, like the natural heritage programs, they are the folks that's like the same folks that sit on those bodies that determine which species are greatest conservation need.
Hmm. That's really cool. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So, while we're waiting for more questions, I wanted to point out that, and this is, you actually had Leif Richardson in your thank you notes.
Yeah, he's on our paper. He's a co-author.
Yeah, I brought him up before we actually got started, but I don't think anybody else was here yet. And basically, last on Saturday, Leif Richardson from Xerces Society showed up at the La Loma Native Garden, and he led a group of people in showing them how to look for bumblebees. And the he's doing the Bumblebee Atlas, and what he's been asking people to do is to learn how to use a method of collecting bumblebees, but you actually are, I'm not going to tell you exactly how they do it, but he's able to collect them and inspect them and look at them and help to take photos of them and help to identify what they are, what kind of bumblebees they are. And they are actually doing this atlas, and he is going to be on the May 15th, so that's Thursday, a virtual training. It's a 2 hour training that they're going to be doing to show you how to help him with this citizen science project. And one of the things that they are doing is asking people to do just an hour or so of twice a year, just to go around and collect butterfly or collect the bumblebees and inspect them, take photos of them, and then send in information on what you found. And while we were at the La Loma Native Garden, we did collect the bumblebees, and we found Van Dyke's bumblebees, and
Nice.
we found California bumblebees, and and so it was really fun, a lot of fun. And so I asked him, "Hey, can we get you to come down here again?" And he said, "Well, maybe next year." But definitely, I think it would be really fun to have him come down and do, I don't know, something for our local area. You know, make it a little bit more public than what ended up happening. But it's just a lot of fun. And on May 15th, like I said, you can sign up for this class he's giving and learn how to do this to help. And so, you know, obviously we need to get somebody down to do it. I'm going to try and do this myself, but at La Loma, and keep kind of checking out what kind of bumblebees we have there. But in my backyard, or you know, other places where we have good native plants and stuff like that, it'd be really cool to figure out what kind of bumblebees we have in the area. So.
Yeah, I'll just give a plug for it as well. I live in Sonoma County, and I participated the last couple of years. It's extremely fun to do. You get to, see the bumblebees up close and learn more about which ones you've got. But it's super important as well for us to contribute data for all of these conservation things that are happening at Xerces, at NatureServe, at the state level. It's really important for us to get these data. NatureServe is fantastic about just taking the data, identifying the species, and then making it publicly available. So it really does go a long way for conservation. And then not only is it really fun to do. Yeah.
Cool.
We have two more questions. Have recent severe federal funding cuts at science-based agencies affected your ability to do your important work?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's been touch and go, I'd say. We've had several grants sort of put on pause, and been sort of kind of up in the air a little bit. Uh, Luckily, we've still been able to continue doing some work, doing our work, and for the most part, haven't been too affected. There's been, we collaborate a lot with these federal agencies, and so, there's been some coworkers or external coworkers that have been more impacted. So yeah, I would say it has, not to the degree that it has in some other organizations, but definitely as a conservation community, I think, it has. Yeah.
And Janet asks, can we create puddling resources in our gardens?
Can you create what kind of resources?
Puddling?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So puddling, for those of you who may not know, is a behavior that many insects do, or probably all of them. It's basically to get minerals out of the ground. Um, And so you'll see them, on puddles or on rocks that are slightly wet, or even actually dung. They'll go to poop or some other resources like that. Um, and so just to get kind of minerals, because sometimes they need other things to survive off of the nectar. So yeah, you can definitely create resources. I'm not entirely sure exactly how. I bet there's some guidance out there, but even just having kind of a sort of dirt, gravelly area that you water occasionally, or even like a low sort of lying bird bath type thing might work with rocks in it, to kind of give off some minerals. That might work. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's all we have for our questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Cornelisse and Janet and Mike for hosting. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight and learning about how we can save more pollinators and recent science and pollinator declines, especially for Central Valley. Having this research pertaining to the Central Valley is very much needed and needs to be highlighted. So us at CNPS will do our best to highlight your amazing work at NatureServe.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, it was great. Thank you. Thank you for good work too.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.